Hello everyone, my name is Kari. This is Tiger Lily Designs. Welcome to week 1 of the Beanie-A-Long. Yay, are you excited? I'm so excited. Okay, so hopefully you have already watched. Step 1 is watching the long tail cast on. This is how we're going to cast on for our gauge swatch. Because week 1, we're going to be working on gauge swatching. I want to have a little bit of an introduction here to explain to you what is a gauge swatch? Why do we need a gauge swatch? And then we're going to dive into the tutorial of how to do said gauge swatch. So when you have a knitting pattern, whether you get it on Ravelry or whether you get it from a knitting book or wherever you get your pattern, it will always give you the suggested yarn, the patterns, the needle size, and the gauge. What gauge is gauge is stitches per inch. Okay, so when you're looking at a fabric, which is what we call our knitted up, this is my gauge swatch we're going to knit today, but this is my fabric. And so you want to know how many stitches per inch, and that's your gauge. Now I wanted to provide a little bit of clarification right here, just so there's no confusion later on when you're like, what? This pattern doesn't make any sense. So when you measure a gauge swatch, you're going to measure per inch, right? Okay, so for example, later on we're gonna do it, but you're gonna measure per inch. But the gauge numbers that are given in patterns are for 4 inches. I know. So if your gauge is 5, your actual per inch. 5 times 4 is 20. So you will look whenever you buy, sometimes when you buy commercial yarn, sometimes when you buy hand-dyed yarn, wherever the things like that, it'll tell you the gauge, 18 to 19, 20 to 21. Those are for 4 inches. So that's how a gauge swatch is given to you out in the knitting world. I just didn't want to overwhelm you, and I kind of skipped over the steps, so I wanted to come back and clarify. We are going to be doing the gauge per inch, but it's technically given in patterns for the 4-inch gauge. Hope that makes sense. Your gauge. Now there's 3 components that factor into making said gauge. Your yarn. DK yarn is what we're using for a beanie. If I had a thicker yarn, we would have less stitches per inch, right? Because they're bigger and thicker and wider, right? Okay, so the 3 components that make up a gauge swatch, or your gauge, is going to be your yarn size, so DK, and then obviously we've talked about yarn during material, so I'm not going to confuse you, but the yarn matters. The size of your needle matters. So remember we talked about needles during the materials video that come in all different sizes, all the way from US 0 to US 15, I think, and they just keep getting thicker and thicker and thicker, right? So yarn, needles, and you are the 3rd piece that goes into the gauge equation. Depends on how you knit. Are you a tight knitter, or are you a loose knitter, or are you somewhere in between? Those are the components. Why is it so important for gauge? So to test your gauge, I gauge swatch because I'm new and I'm trying to help you set up for a success. Gauge swatch. It doesn't take that long. I know it's not any fun. There's nothing you can do with this pretty piece except look at it and say, "Ooh, that's so pretty." It's not functional. It's not a hat, but it'll set you up for success. It is worth it until you feel comfortable and know with DK and these needles. I don't gauge swatch anymore for my beanies. I know all my gauges with a DK and the US 6. I know what it is, but you don't. Not yet, at least. You will after this. So what we're going to do is I'm going to teach you how to gauge swatch. But again, I just want to explain a little bit why it's important. It's important because when you do go later on in your knitting journey, you're going to read a pattern. And if you're making a sweater, if your gauge is off, it's either going to be way too big. Same thing can happen for a hat. I talked about it in the story, and that if you just follow the pattern blindly, use the right yarn, use the right needles, you should be good to go. Let's just knit the pattern. You don't know your 3rd component, if your hat's going to be too big or too tight. You don't want that. So you want it to be perfect. And so we're going to knit a gauge swatch, especially because the pattern that I have written that we're going to be using for the Beanie-A-Long is going to give you the math. Don't worry, it's not hard. We can do it. We're going to do it together. But the math to give you the perfect beanie for your head or your daughter's head or your husband's head or, you know, whoever, your mama's head, whoever's head you're going to work on. We're going to take your gauge and come up with your unique, perfect beanie. The math is, it's going to be your perfect beanie. And so I'm super excited. So before we get into it, I just wanted to explain why we're doing it. It's not fun, but it's helping you. And it's also a great way, if you are new to knitting, it's a great way to practice your knit stitch before you get to your finished product, right? Because we're going to be stitching. We've got our 25 cast on ready to go on our needles, right? From our cast on video. That's linked down below or linked up here if I figure out how to do it. And then we're going to gauge swatch. So we're going to knit in the round and have a swatch. So let's dive in, friends. Once you have your long tail, your stitches cast on for the gauge swatch, so this is 25 stitches. Now we're going to start our gauge swatch. And because we're knitting a beanie, you always want to gauge swatch in the same pattern, the same method you're going to stitch your finished product. So if you're knitting flat, you'd want to knit a flat swatch. Since we are knitting in the round, we want our gauge swatch to be in the round. So that's what we need to do. So this was where I ended my long tail cast on. Now what I need to do is take this and slide it down. This is what we're going to have to do after every row. This is recreating the round aspect of it. Because if we were going around, if we were going back around, we would just be connecting right here, like in a circle. But because we're knitting flat, we have to kind of make up for it. So here we have the 25 stitches. Now we don't want to mess with our tail yarn anymore. The yarn that we were worried about before when we were doing our long tail, let's just get that out of the way. We are only going to be knitting with our cake yarn. So I've got a nice piece of cake yarn ready to go. And we're going to have to hold it across the back. Now let me show you what that means. I want to show you what we're doing before we start doing it, so maybe it helps it, you can visualize it. So right here, you can see this is where I cast on. And these are the in the round Kari pieces. So we're going to wrap around every time we go. Some are looser, some are tighter. It doesn't matter as long as it doesn't pull the stitch, the knit fabric taut, because we're going to be using this to measure our gauge. So I gauge swatch. This was for one of my sweaters I did. I always then put, you know, what this is exactly. But you can see this is what I used to measure my gauge swatch. And I was knitting a sweater in the round, so this is my piece. So this is what we're going to be doing. So I just wanted to show you what we're doing before we started doing it. Maybe it'd help it make sense a little bit. Like I said, we're going to hold this so you get a little extra, little excess in the back, just so that we're not holding it taut. Now I'm going to tell you, your first go round is going to be tighter, in that it's not going to be easy to grab because you're working into your cast on stitches. So to knit, so this is both a gauge swatch tutorial and a knit tutorial. So let me let the camera focus. So you've got your stitches, you've got your niches, you've got your cast on stitches in your left hand, and in your right hand, you've got your other set. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your right needle. Now, so this excess loop is already dealt with. You're going to stick your right needle under and behind to knit this. So the gauge swatch is all the knit stitch, and we're doing it in the round. So you're going to stick it in, take this yarn, wrap it around, pull it up and off. Again, this first one is a little finicky depending on how good your tension was when you were casting on. Practice, practice, practice does make perfect, or at least makes it more comfortable. Stick it behind, wrap it around, pull it up and off. In, around, loop up and off. Under, around. So I am going to just keep talking you through at least 2 rows, and then we're going to speed up. But for this gauge swatch, just keep watching what I'm doing. I know that when I was learning, I just watched so many people, and I would pause and do it again and pause and do what they were doing. Hopefully this is going to help you. So up and over, up and over, and then you slide it off. So you want to keep your stitches straight on the needle, otherwise you're going to get twisted. We're going to talk about getting it twisted later on when we're doing beanies, because we definitely don't want twisted stitches, but just being cognizant of it is just good practice. So under, over, up and off, under, yarn over. That's it. This is the knit stitch. You are doing it. So again, we're going to do 25 knit stitches, and then all of a sudden, all of our cast on stitches are going to be off the left needle and all on the right needle. And then we're just going to do it again. So when you're knitting a gauge swatch, you're going to knit, we knit 25 across. So usually a 25 by 25 square is a good rule of thumb. So now my left needle's empty and they're all on the right. We're going to get them all straight, get the nice colorful, doesn't look, and there's my carry forward. You see it right there? There it is. And now we're going to do it again. So what we're going to do is we're going to just slide those stitches around the loop, around the circle, and we're going to do it again. It's so fun. Round and round we go. So again, making sure not to grab the tail yarn. That one's just kind of in the way, but we're just going to ignore it. Grab the cake yarn. Give it a nice extra. So what I was saying is your first and last stitch on your circular gauge swatch, you can see they're not pretty. Because you're knitting in the round, some of them are gonna be looser, some of them are gonna be wonky. That's okay. That's why we knit 25 of them, so that we can get a good gauge measurement right here in the center, where all those pretty knit stitches make a pretty fabric. We can get a nice gauge measurement there. So this is what we're trying to create. Hold on, let me get this untangled. Here we go. All right, we're gonna do it one more time together, and then we're gonna fast forward. So let's see. Okay, so pull that out. I kind of wrap it around my middle finger just to make sure that I never want it to be too taut. Too loose is fine, too taut is not. So again, the first stitch is always the hardest because you're dealing with kind of like a loose stitch. But you pull it off and there it is good to go. Once you wrap around your second one, now you can let that yarn go and you're going to knit again. So just in, under, behind, wrap around, slide it up and off, under, around, slide over and off. That's it. That's the knit stitch. So once you start doing it, listen, I am not super fast. You can watch, some people can knit without looking. Some people can be like doing 12 other things. I do have to look at my needles when I knit. I am going a little faster now that I'm talking to you. But, you know, this is just what comes with practice, I think. You know, I'm still new, and so I still have to think about each stitch, but it is a wonderfully mindless thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this, like I said, so we knit 25 stitches on, and we're going to want to do 25 rows. So we are going to get a good gauge swatch. So again, remember that last stitch is also going to be kind of wonky. And now we're going to Get everything untwisted like, right? Take a moment to get yourself set. Don't drop a stitch. Now it's all straight, and we slide around again. So hopefully this is starting to make sense a little bit. So we're going to grab our tail one more time. Wrap it around my middle finger just so I don't lose it. I always still hold it when I'm doing the second one because I don't feel, even the third one sometimes, I don't feel like I'm good and caught until I get 3 stitches in. See? And now you can actually start to see the knit stitch. Do you see it? And it's really easy to see with this beautiful Sugar Rush yarn. Okay, so I have knit 23, 24, about that many rows, plenty of fabric for us to do our gauge swatch measurement. So I feel good about binding off. So let's bind off our gauge swatch. So let me show you how you're going to do that. So we're going to go one more time. So I had slid this over to the left-hand side, just like I would do if I was going to knit one more row. Just ignore that Hot Mess Express back there, okay? So I'm going to grab and do this one more time, and I'm going to knit the first 2 stitches. So I'm going to knit 2. All right, so right now I've got 2 stitches on and the rest of them are here. So to bind off, I'm going to take my left needle and take it up and over. Watch me do it again. So I'm going to then knit another stitch. Now I have 2 again. I'm going to take the one on the back, lift it up and over, leaving 1. So you can see I'm just keeping 1 and moving 1 and losing 1. So at the end, we won't have any live stitches on needles. So I knit 1, then I take my left needle and pull up and over. Now it's going to be easier to see with the different color. So I'm going to knit 1, up and over. And I'm just going to keep on doing that. And so all I'm doing is every time I knit up and over, you can see I'm taking the stitches off the needle. This is very simple bind off. This isn't something you'd probably want to do. Well, again, it works whenever. This is just it's not as stretchy, but you can see just the knit stitches right there, binding off. So I'm going to knit, go up, over, and off. And you're just going to continue to do that for all 25 stitches. All right, we're going to get down to the end. These last stitches, we just keep doing what we're doing. There's going to be 1 extra step when we've got our last stitch to get off the needle. Again, remember the edges are not the prettiest, but they still are knit together. So we knit 1 and off, and so I have 1 stitch left. Cut the yarn right there. So we've got 1 live stitch. This was the end of my cake yarn. I'm going to stick it in the hole. And that's going to knot it up. And now you will see that my gauge swatch is off the needles. And let me show you what's next. Okay, so we've got our gauge swatch all knit up. See, it's all curly cued up like that. It's not ready for measuring yet. There's one more step we need to do before it gets measured properly. And you can see the difference between my two gauge swatches. This one's nice and flat. It's already been blocked. This is another one of those knitting vocab words. You want to block your yarn. This is going to let the yarn and the fibers bloom and grow. And so that way, when you do your gauge swatch measurings, you always want to measure with a blocked piece. It definitely changes after. So you want to make sure you pay attention to your yarn band. It usually tells you what to do. Hand wash, cold. If you're using 100% superwash merino wool, it's pretty standard that they're going to say in hand wash, cold lay, flat to dry. That's pretty standard. So what I've done is I've gone ahead and put, it's cold-ish. Room temperature is my goal. It's not like icebox cold, but room temperature water. And I've got my Knit IQ wash. Now, if you don't have this, that's okay. Just a nice, delicate, mild soap just to give it some time. So you're going to follow the directions on your soap. What you're going to do is you just take a bowl and dunk it. Now, don't agitate this. This is wool. It will, you don't want to agitate it. It could felt. That's more important, that you're cold, that your water is not warm. So just stick it in there, give it a little bit of swoosh, and let it sit for the time that your soap says. Mine says about 10-15 minutes, and this is a no rinse. So we're going to come back and I'll show you what's next. Okay, so I have allowed the allotted amount of time for my swatch to soak. And because it's no rinse, I'm just going to go ahead and gently squeeze out the excess water. If yours is a rinse soap, make sure you just rinse out, but be delicate. And now what we're going to do is we're going to block it. So I'm going to put my water aside. Now you can either use blocking mats, which I have linked in my Amazon shop. You don't need those though, because I also, in my previous, before I got blocking mats, just used a towel. So you can cut your stitches if they're in your way, but you're going to want to just open it up. You just want to lay out, kind of stretch out and flatten, smooth out. You don't want to stretch or pull, but you just want to allow your stitches to open up and bloom. If you're doing a sweater, or when you're going to block a sock or a beanie, you might put pins in, which is why the blocking mats are really, really important and helpful, because you would take T-pins and kind of pin it up, and so it wouldn't, switch up on itself. But for a swatch, this definitely gets the job done. So just smooth it out and let it sit about overnight, and then we're going to come back and measure it. Okay, so we let our gauge swatch dry overnight and it is ready to go. So now we need to measure our gauge. What that means is, so with these needles, we used a size 6 with this weight yarn and with our tension. So your hands, those are the 3 components that are going to determine your gauge: your yarn, your needles, and you. Everybody's different. Everybody knits with different, whether you're a tight knitter or a loose knitter. That's why the gauge swatch is so hard important. So let me show you how to measure your gauge. So you're going to need a ruler. So you can either use this fancy knitting kind, which magnifies it. Don't need it. I'm going to show you how to do it. Just a standard ruler. So you're going to take your ruler, and we're going to do it in a couple different spots just to confirm that everything is above board. So we're looking for the 1 inch stitch count. So let me show you. So here I am. I'm going to start at the 0. I'm going to put my 0 line at the bottom of this stitch. You can see it's right here lined up. And I'm going to run it parallel. And I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and a half. Let's do it again. Let's move over, move up and over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5. That's why you wanted to do a nice big, so you can get into the rhythm and really get a good and accurate gauge swatch. So my gauge swatch for this yarn, US size needles, and my tension is a 5.5. So what I'm gonna do is you're gonna get out your Tiger Lily Beanie-A-Long math. We're gonna start this worksheet on week 2, but for right now, we have now got our gauge stitch number. So you're gonna put 5.5 or whatever yours is right there. And week 2, we're gonna let all the math fun begin. So I hope that was helpful. Of course, if you have any questions, we're going to have a live Q&A. Check the Patreon page, and I will be announcing when that live Q&A is, so you can get any specific questions answered before week 2. But until next time, friends, happy knitting.